past is written, but we are left to write the future.
But we are left to write the future. Well, not everybody gets to write the future of the Star Trek franchise. I'm Harley Sims, and this is the Atlas of Elsewhere, a podcast dedicated to all things imaginative. It's been a while since I recorded an episode, but a couple of things happened this January that made me want to sit down and talk about them, because I think they're both pretty important to the world of imagination. The first is the death of Christopher Tolkien, son of J.R.R. Tolkien, his youngest son, but more importantly, his literary executor. I think most people will know Christopher Tolkien as the editor of the Silmarillion, but he was a lot more than that. He published, edited a lot of his father's original material, but he was also a tireless defender of his father's vision, of what he felt to be the true artistic, spiritual, philosophical values of Tolkien's Legendarium. He was no fan of the films. He did not like people taking and cheapening his father's work. With his death, I think an era has ended, especially since Amazon Studios recently, in 2017, acquired the television rights to Tolkien's work. Another thing that happened in January was the launch of the series Star Trek Picard, a continuation of the Star Trek timeline, picking up 20 years more or less after the events of the last Star Trek film, other than the Abrams films. I mean, I'm talking about Star Trek Nemesis, which was Star Trek The Next Generation. I think we had all made peace with the idea that Patrick Stewart had put away his captain's pips and would not reprise the role of Jean-Luc Picard. But of course, this January, he has done just that. Rather than talk about Star Trek Picard as a product, I wanted to kind of tie it into Christopher Tolkien's legacy and look at the idea of imagination and ownership. Because just as we are going to be exposed to reimaginings of Tolkien's work, we are also being exposed to reimaginings of Jean-Luc Picard and the Star Trek universe. Now, who owns the imaginative? Who owns an imaginative franchise? I mean, I think it goes without saying that fans of fantasy and science fiction, especially these two franchises, are probably the most hardcore of all audiences. I mean, they dress up for it, they have their own communities, and aside from that, I mean, there's also a lot of people who don't take part in the fan culture, who may not attend Comic Cons or play Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that, but who really do enjoy Tolkien and Star Trek. You just watched it, you really enjoyed it, grew up with it. And I wanted to talk about how we come to see ourselves as the guardians of a tradition, how we basically imprint upon this material, we imagine it, and we come to see it as our own in a way. And we live in the age of reboots. Seems like every time we turn around, they're taking an old story, an old film, an old franchise that's been dormant for a little while. And there are also film series that keep changing as they continue onwards. I mean, I just watched the newest trailer for Fast and the Furious 9. I mean, does anybody remember what Fast and the Furious used to be about? There are a lot of expectations. There are a lot of people that have established understandings of and love for this material. And they want to see how this reboot or remake will handle it, whether it's respectful, whether it's faithful, what it does new. Of course, we are in the age of progressivism and innovation, and everything is supposed to be moving forward in a way. Well, what does that mean when it comes to imaginative material? Who has the right to do that? I don't know if I want to talk about property rights, immediately, although it does ultimately boil down to that. I'd rather begin with an honest and open consideration of fandom and imagination, and how it is that audiences become the guardians of a tradition, and how their tastes become the touchstones to which new material must answer. I think it's arguable that fans of fantasy and science fiction are particularly jealous of their love. It's territorial for them. And I think the reason that's the case is because of the nature of imagination. The imaginative is symbiotic. As fiction, it requires an imagination on which to operate, not simply someone to come up with its material. I mean, That may sound obvious. All entertainment requires an audience. But I think it can be argued that highly imaginative fiction, the likes of Star Trek and Lord of the Rings, stuff that bends or breaks our understanding of possibility, it relies more on the audience's own imagination. It makes a contract with their credulity and with their trust even. And it leads them to a place they'd never find on their own. It takes them there and basically makes them into, well, a native of it. Think of any story or material you would call imaginative. The territory where they take you, whether a place, a physical place, or a possibility, they create offshoots in our minds, or bifurcations, where realities diverge. Whether you're exploring, Mervyn Peak's Gormenghast or Hogwarts or Beleriand or anything else, it's laying down soil. And our minds as human beings and as animals are geared toward geography and layout. It's even how our memories best function. If you've read Josh Foer's Moonwalking with Einstein, it's how you maximize your memory by imagining a place, a house, any place you know well, and stocking it with things you want to remember. And when you go into those different rooms, different places, you see the things, you visualize what you're trying to remember, and you can remember ponderous amounts of information that way. And that's because our minds look for maps. And whether it is a real place like our hometown or our house, or whether it's a world that we have explored through our imagination, it cannot be unremembered. It just fixes itself in our brains. Now, because of this, imaginative fiction is much more personal and subjective, it's private, than nonfiction is. When we're reading something that we believe to be true, whether it be a description of a place, a city, the outline, schematics of a space shuttle, even if we haven't been there or seen those things ourselves, our imagination of it becomes a placeholder to be replaced by actual experience, whether or not that actual experience ever comes. Whereas with imaginative fiction, stuff that doesn't exist, can't be directly investigated, like Rohan, like Gormenghast, like Hogwarts, like the Starship Enterprise, our imagination is the reality. And because our imaginations use our own experiences to activate what we imagine, what we read, what we feel, what we speculate, has only our own resources to draw on, we end up with something that is utterly personal. We can talk about it with other people, language is a compromise in itself, but we never actually ultimately have the same experience of imaginative material as other people do. We have our own. We can develop it. We can go back and have different experiences, but it is ours. It is private. It cannot be, laid out among us and explored objectively and publicly. And I think that's why we become so jealous of it. We become so guarded against those who would intrude upon it. Well, you can imprint upon something without ever seeking to become a huge fan of it. If you grew up watching Star Trek, the original series, or Batman, the animated series in the 90s, or anything like that, you can become a fan of something even if you never tried to catalog the episodes or speak a word of Klingon. Look at some of your friends and family, and you might love them to death, but you aren't able to list all their vital statistics, their birth date, their zodiac sign, their social insurance number, all that stuff. I mean, there is a difference between love and knowledge. So you can love a show, a book, a series, without ever having, sought to become a scholar of it. In that sense, especially with long-standing franchises like Star Trek, like Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's material, they form a kind of wallpaper in people's mental rooms. They become a mural, kind of a painting down the hallway of one's life. Just to give you an example, I remember when Transformers was coming out as a film, 2007, when Michael Bay made the first Transformers film. And growing up in the 80s, I was a huge Transformers fan. I bought all the toys I could, asked for the toys for every birthday and Christmas. I read the comic books. I wrote my own Transformers stories. And my cousin and I were both right into it. I had seen a live-action animation of a Freightliner cab-over transforming, and that's what Optimus Prime was in Generation 1. He's that, flat-nosed tractor or semi-truck But it's a Freightliner cab over is what it is. And I saw someone animate it transforming on the internet. Just as Optimus Prime transformed as a toy, the frame becomes his legs with the fifth wheel in the back, and the arms swing out from the headlights, and it was just awesome. I remember just being blown away, like holy cow, like he's standing there among buildings, like there's a truck there, and now it's a robot, and it's not a cartoon, and I called up my cousin on the phone, and I walked him through finding it online, and I remember him just being blown away as well. And my uncle was a truck driver as well, and he drove the exact kind of truck that Optimus Prime was. It wasn't red, it was blue and white. I mean, I was around vehicles like that. I've been inside them, and so for me it had a personal significance. And a lot of people love Transformers, but not all of them will love Transformers because they had a family member who drove one of those trucks, for example. Although some people might love them because they had a family member in the Air Force and they liked the aerial bots, for example. I remember watching the movie when it came out, and my cousin never got to see it, which is one of the reasons why this franchise remains so important to me. I watched the movie, and Michael Bay changed a bunch of stuff. He wasn't a big fan to begin with, and he changed not only the truck but the way it transformed, and it seemed a desecration. It's not enough to throw a fit or something, but it bothered me. That original material meant something, and I didn't know why it was that a show that ran off the original name and the goodwill and the fan base it had established, to get me to come in and see it, felt so entitled to change it. It seemed like a Trojan horse kind of shoved into my brain, and then it opened up once it was inside, and something unfriendly came out of it. Now, the Transformers, of course, were a toy line. The cartoon existed to sell the toys. It was good versus evil, so there really wasn't a lot of complexity to it. Only a child could really imprint upon it that deeply. When it comes to more complex material, like, for example, Tolkien's Legendarium, we can speak of watchdogs, people who guard against corruption or cheapening of the material, such as Christopher Tolkien was. Christopher Tolkien grew up listening to his father's stories about not only Middle-earth, but Beleriand and the other continents of Arda. He huddled for warmth in his father's study, listening to stories about Beren and Luthien and Morgoth and the Silmarils and all that. I mean, this was long before The Hobbit was written, before The Lord of the Rings was even an idea, really, in his father's mind. And as a result, he came to be fiercely protective of his father's work. And he spoke out against Peter Jackson's film adaptations. In an interview with Le Monde, the French newspaper, in 2012, he expressed his belief that the film had eviscerated the books. And he said that Tolkien has largely been consumed by his own popularity. What makes him so popular has stripped away, the philosophical and aesthetic beauty of the original works. And he said he has no other choice than to turn his head and look the other way. The advantage for Christopher Tolkien, of course, is that as Tolkien's literary executor and the chair of the Tolkien estate, he had a say in who could adapt his father's work. He happened to be that sort of person who was a purist, but who also owned the rights. And I don't think there are many people left who would sit on a franchise worth $6 billion, say, and not budge if he didn't think that the product was worthy of the original material. And there's the business side to it, of course. Tolkien himself had sold the film rights to his work in 1968 for £100,000, which I think adjusted for inflation now is about £1.5 million. So although, of course, the films brought new attention to the books, it must have been bittersweet to see these films making billions of dollars when the rights had already been sold. And of course, because the rights had been sold, there was no involvement of the estate. Christopher Tolkien couldn't step in and oversee the production. As a purist, and despite the money involved, I do believe he had the integrity of his father's work in mind. I don't think he really would sell out on that. The same thing's going on with Anders Sapkowski in the Witcher franchise. Anders Sapkowski sold the rights, the electronic rights to the Witcher franchise back in, I think the 90s. And of course, The Witcher 3, made by CD Projekt Red, was one of the best-selling video games of all time. It is an incredible game. It's an incredible story. And it has brought attention to his books. I don't think many people would even have bothered reading The Witcher stories or had heard of them, if not for the video game. And now the Netflix series has been made based on the books, which Anders Sapkowski had a part in, I believe. But he hates video games. He hates the video games. He doesn't like what they've done. And so, again, though, there are legal matters and copyright and intellectual property and contracts involved. So it's tough to tease the purism and the guardianship from the money. But because Christopher Tolkien is no longer with us, it remains to be seen how Tolkien's legacy will be handled now by the remaining members of the Tolkien estate. What sort of oversight they will have, what sort of products we'll see as the popularity of Tolkien's work continues to compel new work, new productions. Maybe down the road we'll see more writing taking place in his world. It won't be Tolkien, but it will be Middle-earth. And now to move on to a franchise that lost its watchdog in 1991, we have Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry died during the 4th season of Star Trek The Next Generation, or while it was airing. He, of course, the visionary behind Star Trek, the original series, came up with the idea of a future where humankind has put aside its petty squabbles and even its need for currency and has dedicated itself to self-improvement, self-betterment, and exploring the universe. Star Trek The Next Generation was the culmination of that vision, I believe. And it carried on for the next 3 years and into the 4 films afterwards, which ended in 2002 with Star Trek Nemesis. At one time, one could not speak of Star Trek without implying Gene Roddenberry's vision. But now, strangely enough, one can. The Star Treks we have had since the 3 J.J. Abrams films, Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Picard, to an extent, Star Trek Enterprise, have been going in a different direction. They've kind of moving away from the space opera that made Star Trek fun and optimistic. To give an example, there's a scene in episode 2 of Star Trek Picard where he's speaking to a friend and Picard tells him that he wants to go back out into space. And his friend tells him, can't believe you want to go back out into the cold, and he says it like this. It's like it's this terrifying deep black void, the sort of thing, we encountered in 2001: A Space Odyssey, or, Sunshine, or Ad Astra. That's never what outer space was in Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. It had its enemies and it had its threats, but it was all about finding new civilizations, new peoples, learning things, and realizing that the universe, this black canvas we look up at from the Earth, is actually full of peoples and civilizations like our own that we can learn from. But Star Trek, above all, I think, was fun. It was uplifting. It was buoyant. You could watch it and cheer yourself up. And it wasn't just because of its campiness, as some people have alleged it to be. It was because it was optimistic, and it was organized, and everybody had their uniforms. Everything was clean, and the equipment worked properly. You could trust the organization. Even though Enterprise tried to be true to Roddenberry's vision by basically showing how we got there, trying to kind of bridge the gap between the original series and our own present, and the World War that kind of brought us all together afterwards. It was still about violence and being thrown into disarray, having the ship like broken down and not working and wondering what we were going to do and we're in over our heads. And Discovery has taken its own angle. And look, I want to make it clear that I don't do this podcast to disseminate my own tastes. I have tastes, and they're pretty militant. But as a critic and a writer, I admit that I tend to vivisect things I ought to just shake hands with. With Star Trek Picard, and we having a franchise that's been dormant for a long time, and a fan base that has been marinating in nostalgia. So when a studio announces that the story will go on, and not only that, but they're bringing back the original actors, it seems like a resurrection. It seems like something beloved coming back from the dead. And it does things to our mind we don't have complete control over. That said, we have become wary of this. Star Wars did this. It brought back, all the original actors with the latest trilogy and did bad things to them, I think you could say. Linda Hamilton was brought back in the new Terminator film alongside Arnold Schwarzenegger for the first time since Terminator 2. Leonard Nimoy was even brought into Star Trek by J.J. Abrams, the new ones. And it's all part of the hook. That is probably where our protectiveness and our jealousies really come into play. We feel like we're being exploited. We feel like we're all of a sudden transported to a piece of property that is owned and then charged admission, even though we didn't enter the gate. We just suddenly found ourselves there. It's almost like we're being told that the memories that we have of this material were implanted there. They're not real. They have a UPC code, kind of like we've signed up for a vacation in Total Recall. Now, there's a chance we may really enjoy new material. I'm thinking of Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner 2049. I thought it jived really well with the original film. But I think more often than not, we will be a little disturbed by reimaginings of characters we think we know well. It can be like having someone we know come into a room, and even though they look and sound the same, their behavior is off. There's something not quite right. I felt this way watching Star Trek Picard. There was something off about Jean-Luc Picard, and it's because Patrick Stewart has taken control of the role more so than he had on Star Trek The Next Generation. And as the series continued, there were other things, the swearing, the F-bomb in the second episode, the hookup culture we saw a little of, that made it clear this wasn't the Star Trek I love. So what to do? How do we guard against that disappointment? I mean, we can't stop the material from being made. It's going to keep coming out. It's going to keep looking for new audiences, regardless of our own tastes and regardless of how protective we feel about it. Must we close our minds to affection towards fictive material? I think it's possible that we misconstrue our relationship with that material. We approach it as something we want to remain unconditional. It can always keep developing. We'll always love it. And this is naive, of course. It changes hands and faces. And sometimes there's only the most superficial similarities remaining with the original material. It's kind of perverse. I mean, when we speak of something's essence or its importance in anything, and I don't mean just fiction or stories, I mean anything, any person, any value, we speak of its spirit, not its appearance. So although we as fans do not hold the rights to the names of this material, their souls are put together through our imaginations. That is, they are put together through our experiences, the ways we have made them real in our own minds. Their souls are embodied in us, and nothing can take that away. No reboot, no continuation, no substitute. Nonetheless, I do think the lessons are hard ones, and unfortunately, this is something that I've had to teach my children when they sit down to come up with their own stories. I warn them, don't write a story about Harry Potter unless you want J.K. Rowling to own every word of it. This material is a fishhook in the brain. Some company or other holds the rod. The line may be slack for years and even decades in some cases, but eventually you'll feel it start tugging. Especially in an age of reboots and nostalgia, you'll start feeling yourself reeled in, and you'll be astonished by how deep the hook is snagged. and you'll be pulled up and you'll look up into the boat and see who's holding the rod, and you won't recognize any of these people. You won't recognize the writers, the producers, the actors, the studios, and yet they have these names. And in the same way that watching a film adaptation of a book you enjoyed risks replacing what you have imagined with the film's own audiovisual material, you will risk reshaping or affecting your understanding of original material by exposing yourself to continuations, reboots, or remakes. But the empowerment lies in that material's instability. Because it can't be directly investigated, its essence is plural. It is a multiverse of possibilities, in the same way that comic book universes are composed of multiple dimensions and possibilities and what-ifs. Our rendition of material constitutes its own reality, which is no less valid than any other. No one can imagine on another's behalf. We can look at something we're shown, and we can listen to something we hear, but it doesn't become real until we let it into our minds and give it access to all that we are. I'm Harley Sims, and this has been the Atlas of Elsewhere.